Cabba is not Goku. He is not Vegeta. He is not a living argument for raw destructive output or a meme about power levels. He is a Saiyan from Universe 6, a civilization where Saiyans evolved not as conquerors but as protectors. Disciplined, methodical, respectful to the point that the sub-ORD operatives surrounding him in that crater could not decide whether his bow was a greeting or a threat because nothing in their training had prepared them for both simultaneously. His power, by any measurable standard in the Marvel Universe, was extraordinary. A biological energy output that Tony's systems clocked as somewhere between scientifically implausible and please recalibrate immediately. But the number was not what made Stark's hands still on his keyboard. What made his hands still was the self-limiting signature underneath it. The clear, measurable evidence that whatever this thing was, it was choosing, deliberately and precisely, how much of itself to express. That kind of control was not instinct. That was training, and training implied intent. Marvel's universe is not evil. That is the most important and most terrifying thing about it. It is a universe of good intentions ground down by ego, trauma, and the specific institutional rot that develops when powerful organizations spend decades deciding that their judgment supersedes everyone else's. Its heroes are brilliant and broken in roughly equal measure. Its governments treat enhanced individuals as assets first and people second. Its idealism is perpetually outpaced by its politics. Nick Fury, watching the crater footage from a secure, undisclosed location, spoke 4 words to the analyst beside him: "Don't let him leave," and meant them not as cruelty, but as standard operational caution, because in Fury's experience, the most dangerous variables were never the ones that arrived screaming, they were the ow-ness that arrived bowing. Doctor Strange felt it first, before the SWORD teams deployed, before Stark's readouts came back inconclusive, before Fury said anything to anyone. He felt it as a wrongness in the fabric of local space-time, not a tear, not a wound, something more precise than that, a insertion, deliberate and clean, like a needle pushed through silk without breaking the weave. A life force his instruments had no classification for. Ancient in its structure, biological in its origin, and radiating a quality of compressed potential that made the hairs on his arms rise with the specific instinct that had kept him alive through encounters that should have killed him a dozen times. He did not move immediately. He opened a scrying lens above the crater and watched. And what he watched was a young man standing in the center of 6 weapon systems, completely calm, waiting patiently for someone to tell him where he was. Strange did not speak for almost 30 seconds. Then he said, "This is not a threat. This is a problem, which is considerably worse." Here is what Marvel would see in that moment, and what it would consistently fail to account for in every assessment it ran afterward. Cabba carried no ideology, no flag, no political allegiance to any institution in any universe he had ever visited. He carried training, purpose, and a single foundational principle that Vegeta, his mentor, the Prince of all Saiyans, had impressed on him so deeply it had become structural. Strength exists to protect, not to dominate, not to perform, not to serve the agenda of whoever held the leash, to protect. That principle, in Marvel's universe, a universe where almost every powerful being had learned, at some painful cost, to compromise that idea for survival, registered as something between inspiring and existentially dangerous. Because you cannot negotiate with a princey plea. You cannot recruit it, file it, or contain it in a facility. You can only watch it move through your world and reckon with what it reveals. So here is the real question. Not whether Cabba could survive Marvel, because yes, he could, and the list of things that could stop him from doing so is shorter than most would expect. The real question is what happens when a warrior built entirely on honor lands in a universe that has spent decades teaching everyone that honor is a liability. Does Marvel preserve him, recruit him, break him? Or does he become the one thing this cracked and brilliant and exhausted universe has never managed to produce on its own? A hero it cannot corrupt. If you want to know the answer, do not move. Because we are 8 seconds into the most dangerous arrival in Marvel's history, 6 operatives are still pointing weapons at a Saiyan who has not yet decided to be offended by that. And somewhere above the atmosphere, something that commands time itself has just run a calculation and concluded that what just landed in that crater needs to be removed from the timeline immediately. The universe had no idea what it had let in. Subscribe right now, because this channel exists in exactly this space, where the wrong warrior ends up in the right disaster and we find out what breaks first, the warrior or the world. Hit subscribe, drop a comment. Tell me this right now. Do you think Marvel would make Cabba better, or would it eventually break him? Because I promise you, by the time this story ends, your answer is going to change. And now, let's begin. The containment cell was white. Completely, aggressively, institutionally white. The specific shade of white that says we built this room to remind you that you are being managed. Cabba sat in the center of it on a metal chair that was clearly not designed for comfort, hands resting on his knees, spine straight, breathing at a rate that the monitoring equipment logged as abnormally calm for a detained extraterrestrial entity. He had been here for 6 hours. He had answered every question the debrief team asked him, completely, without hesitation, without legal counsel, without the specific performance of selective memory that SWORD's interrogators had learned to expect from enhanced individuals who understood that information was leverage. He simply told the truth, all of it, and that the complete, unstrategic, utterly disarming honesty of it made the senior analyst running the session deeply uncomfortable in a way she could not immediately articulate in her report. She settled for the phrase, "Subject displays atypical behavioral profile." What she meant was, this is not how powerful things act when they are trapped. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what Cabba actually is, not the power level. The power level is almost secondary to the point. What Cabba is, at his core, is a scion shaped by a completely different evolutionary premise than anything Marvel had ever encountered or Universe 7 had ever produced. Universe 6. Saiyans did not build their strength through conquest, they built it through protection. Their civilization developed its warrior tradition, not as an expression of dominance, but as a response to the need for defense. Organized, disciplined, deliberately restrained. Cabba was the product of that tradition in its most complete form. He fought not because he needed to prove something, not because battle fed something hungry inside him, but because somewhere out in the universe there were always people weaker than him, who needed someone stronger than them to be standing in the right place at the right time. That was the whole architecture. Clean, simple, and in Marvel's universe, a universe where almost every powerful being had a complicated psychological relationship with their own strength, almost incomprehensibly foreign. His power, translated into Marvel's measurement systems, produced readings that Tony Stark described in his personal log as cosmically rude. The biological energy output, ki, though that word meant nothing to any instrument Stark had ever built, registered as somewhere in the range of a localized stellar event compressed into approximately 165 pounds of calm, politely cooperative extraterrestrial. It was not gamma radiation. It was not the cosmic frequency of an infinity stone. It was not Asgardian magic or the output of a mutant X gene pushed past its natural ceiling. It was life force, pure, structured, self-contained biological will, compressed to a density that should have been physically impossible in a living organism without divine enhancement. What made Stark's diagnostic runs genuinely unsettling was not the magnitude, it was the self-limiting signature running beneath it. A deliberate, measurable ceiling that Cabba had placed on his own output. The suit's systems flagged it 17 times as an anomaly before Stark manually overrode the alerts and sat very still, because the implication was not subtle. Whatever this was, it was choosing how much of itself to be, and it was choosing less than it was capable of, which meant the actual ceiling was somewhere the instruments had not yet found. The landing site had been the eastern edge of a mid-sized city, close enough to civilization that 17 different camera systems caught the arrival, far enough from Manhattan that the Avengers had not scrambled immediately. The arrival itself lasted approximately 4 seconds, a rupture in local space-time, not explosive, not theatrical, more like a seam coming undone, and then Cabba, standing in a shallow crater of scorched earth, looking at a skyline he had never seen in any universe he had visited. SWORD's rapid response team reached him in under 8 minutes, which was operationally excellent and tactically irrelevant because in those 8 minutes Cabba had already assessed the gravity, the atmosphere, the ambient energy signatures layering the air around him, and reached his first conclusion about this universe. It was crowded, absolutely saturated with power signatures, weak individually by his training standards, but dense and layered and carrying specific flavors he had no previous reference for. Something solar and ancient from a direction he could not yet locate. Something geometric and deliberate radiating from underground. Something frantic and kinetic moving fast in the middle distance. He did not know he was reading Thor's Asgardian signature, the wards of Kamar-Taj and Spider-Man mid-patrol. He only knew that this universe was alive with force, and that almost none of it felt at rest. When the 6 operatives arrived, weapons raised, demanding identification in 3 languages, Cabba did what no threat assessment protocol in SWORD's entire operational history had a prepared response for. He bowed, fist to chest, head inclined, the precise formal greeting of a Sadala Defense Force warrior meeting individuals who had not yet established whether they were allies or opponents. A gesture that covered both possibilities simultaneously with equal respect. Then he said, clearly and without performance, "I mean no harm to your people. I am trying to understand where I am." The 6 operatives held their positions. Their training said, maintain containment perimeter, await tactical assessment. Their instincts said something considerably less classified. 3 of them, according to later debrief transcripts, described feeling, and struggled visibly with the word in an official context. Believed, not convinced, not strategically reassured, actually simply believed, which was the precise moment the situation stopped being a standard threat response scenario and became something considerably more complicated. He complied with containment because Vegeta had taught him something that most people who knew Vegeta found surprising to attribute to him. A warrior who respects others enough to fight them should respect them enough to hear them first. So Cabba sat in the White Room and answered questions and waited with the patience of someone trained under one of the most demanding mentors in any universe. But compliance was not passivity, and patience was not absence of assessment. In those 6 hours, he was running his own analysis, quieter, less technologically mediated than anything SWORD was doing, but considerably more accurate. What he assessed was this: the people asking him questions were not cruel. They were not malicious. They were operating inside a system that had taught them, through repeated expensive lessons, that powerful things arriving unannounced were problems before they were people. He understood that logic. He did not agree with it, but he understood it well enough to work inside it while he figured out something more important: whether this universe had anyone in it worth working with. Nick Fury received the full debrief transcript at 0300 hours and read it twice. The second time, he read slower. The specific deceleration of a man encountering something that does not fit any existing mental category and choosing to sit with the discomfort rather than force it into a familiar shape. What struck him was not the power readings, not the behavioral profile, not even the self-limiting energy signature that had kept Stark awake running diagnostics. What struck him was a single exchange midway through the transcript. The debrief analyst had asked Cabba, "What do you want?" Standard question. Procedural. Designed to surface agenda. Cabba had paused. The transcript noted a 4-second silence, and then said, "To understand this place. To be useful while I am here, and to find my way home without causing damage to anything that does not need to be damaged." Fury stared at that answer for a long time. In 30 years of intelligence work, he had interviewed hundreds of enhanced individuals, dozens of extraterrestrial entities, and 4 beings of genuine cosmic significance. Not one of them had answered that question without the word "I" appearing at least 3 times in the first sentence. He closed the transcript, opened it again. Then he did something that his senior analyst would have found alarming if they had been watching. He smiled, slightly, briefly. The specific smile of a man recognizing against considerable odds something that might actually be exactly what it appeared to be. Dr. Strange sealed the scrying lens at dawn and stood for a long time at the window of the sanctum, turning the question over in his mind with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that the wrong framing of a correct question was more dangerous than ignorance. The question was not, "What is this?" He had a preliminary answer to that. The question was not, "How powerful is it?" That answer was coming, and he suspected it was going to be uncomfortable for everyone. The question, the one that kept the window open and the lens running and the case file unresolved, was simpler and considerably harder. A being this powerful, this controlled, and this genuinely without agenda has arrived in a universe that will spend every available resource trying to give it one. What happens to something like that in a place like this? And more precisely, how much of what makes it extraordinary survives the attempt? Below him, the city was waking up. Somewhere across town, in a white room in a facility that officially processed 17 threat categories and had just encountered its 18th, a Saiyan from Universe 6 was finishing his 7th hour of patient, honest, completely unstrategic cooperation with a system that did not yet know what to do with him. The story was just beginning, and it was already more complicated than anyone in it had been prepared for. Here is something Marvel's institutions never fully learned. Despite decades of expensive evidence pointing directly at the lesson, containment is not resolution. It is delay dressed in operational language. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of putting a lid on something and calling the lid a solution. And on the 43rd hour of Cabba's detention, the lid came off, not because Cabba removed it, not because his patience finally fractured, but because 3 miles away, a man who could rearrange gravitational fields at will tore through the outer wall of the facility looking for leverage in a score that had nothing to do with anyone inside. Graviton. Franklin Hall, a physicist turned living gravitational catastrophe running on institutional grievance and the specific focused rage of someone who had spent years being studied, contained, and managed by the same machinery that was currently studying, containing, and managing Cabba. The irony was not subtle. The ceiling of Containment Block C collapsed inward at 0340 hours. The power grid followed 11 seconds later. And in the sudden darkness of a cell that was no longer sealed, a Saiyan from Universe 6 stood up, assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds, and walked through a door that had stopped being a barrier the moment the electromagnets powering it lost their charge. What happened in the next 30 seconds is worth describing carefully, because the people who witnessed it spent considerable time afterwards struggling to explain what made it so unsettling. It was not the speed, though the speed was extraordinary. It was not the power output, though the output registered on every backup sensor in the facility simultaneously. It was the silence of it. Graviton was dismantling the building's structural supports with the theatrical fury of someone who needed the destruction to feel like a statement. Concrete grinding, steel bending, the deep percussive bass of load-bearing walls surrendering to forces they were never designed to resist. And then Cabba moved through the chaos, and the noise simply stopped. 4 strikes, each one placed with the specific geometric precision of someone who understood not just where to hit, but why. Targeting the exact points where Graviton's concentration was creating cascading structural failure, disrupting the feedback loop rather than just matching force with force. The 4th strike put Graviton down, unconscious, breathing, arranged, somehow, in a position that would allow emergency responders to reach him safely. The whole engagement, 28 seconds. The silence that followed it lasted considerably longer. Tony Stark watched the footage 6 times. Not because he could not understand what he was seeing. Stark's processing speed was not the issue. He watched it 6 times because he was looking for the moment where Cabba made a mistake, overextended, used more force than necessary, revealed something ruthless or reckless or strategically useful beneath the surgical surface. He did not find it. What he found instead, on the 5th viewing, was something that produced a complicated emotion he was not immediately prepared to name. At the conclusion of the engagement, in the settling dust and the emergency lighting and the chaos of a facility still processing what had just occurred, Cabba had turned to Graviton's unconscious form and bowed. The same gesture, fist to chest, head inclined. The formal acknowledgement of a defeated opponent, not with contempt, not with performance, but with the quiet professional respect of a warrior who understood that the person on the ground was still a person. Stark stopped the playback at that frame, sat with it, then said, to the empty room, "That's either the most calculated thing I've ever seen or the most genuine, and I genuinely cannot tell which." Both possibilities concerned him for entirely different reasons. The Avengers assembled, not full assembly, not yet. This was not classified as a full assembly situation, but the core decision architecture convened within 6 hours. Steve Rogers watched the footage once, said nothing, then watched the bow at the end and said 2 words. He protected them. Not the operatives. They had been in the blast radius, but largely clear. The civilians on the facility's administrative level, the support staff who should not have been in the building at that hour, but were, because facilities like this always had people in them who were not supposed to be in the range of things going wrong. Cabba had threaded his engagement around them with a precision that required awareness of their positions throughout, meaning he had been tracking non-combatants simultaneously with conducting combat, and had treated their safety as a constraint on his method rather than an acceptable variable in it. Rogers recognized that priority structure immediately. It was the same one he had tried, with varying institutional success, to maintain for decades. He looked at the footage of the bow. He looked at the energy readings. Then he looked at Fury and said, "He's not a threat." Fury looked back at him steadily. "No," he agreed. "He's considerably more complicated than that." Thor's reaction arrived separately and carried different weight. When the footage reached him, Thor had a complicated relationship with official briefing schedules, which is a diplomatic way of saying he watched what he wanted when he wanted and filed the paperwork at his own discretion. He went very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of recognition. He had seen thousands of warriors across centuries in 9 realms, and the specific quality of Cabba's movement during the engagement carried a signature Thor had learned to identify long before he had words for it. The signature of someone trained not merely in technique, but in principle. Someone for whom the how of fighting was inseparable from the why. That combination was rare. In Thor's experience, spread across a very long life of meeting extraordinary beings, it was rarer than any power level. He requested a meeting, not a debrief, not a threat assessment interview. A meeting. The distinction was everything, and everyone in the briefing room understood exactly what it meant. Cabba, meanwhile, was reconstructing Marvel's moral architecture from the evidence available to him, and the evidence was not encouraging. In the 72 hours since his arrival, he had been detained without formal charge, subjected to continuous monitoring, offered no information about his legal status in this universe, and surrounded at all times by people whose body language said, "We are being professional about this," while their eyes said, "We have not decided yet whether you are a person or a problem." He understood the operational logic. He was not naive about why powerful things arriving unannounced generated this response. But understanding a logic and endorsing it were different things. And what Cabba was quietly endorsing, in the running analysis he maintained beneath his cooperative surface, was a growing concern about the specific relationship this universe had between its institutions and the individuals those institutions were theoretically designed to protect. The facility that Graviton had attacked, the same facility currently housing Cabba, was not a humanitarian operation. It was a threat management operation. Those were not the same thing. In Universe 6, the distinction was foundational. Here, it seemed to be a footnote. The conversation that broke the institutional deadlock came from the direction nobody in CWORD's threat response framework had anticipated or could have programmatically prevented. A teenager in a red and blue suit swung through a third-floor window that the structural damage from Graviton's attack had left temporarily unmonitored, landed in a 3-point crouch on a briefing table, looked directly at Cabba, and said, "Okay, so I was told very specifically not to be here, but are you actually from another universe? Because I've been to another universe, and honestly the commute is awful and you seem way too calm about it." 6 analysts in the monitoring room immediately began typing incident reports. In the room itself, Cabba looked at Peter Parker for a long moment, assessing, in the specific way he assessed everything, the quality of what was in front of him. Then he said, "The commute was not voluntary." Peter Parker pointed finger guns at him. "Relatable content," he said. And in the monitoring room, one analyst paused mid-report because the subject's biometric stress indicators had just dropped to their lowest recorded levels since arrival. Whatever this was, it was the closest thing to comfort Cabba had registered in 72 hours. Marvel's most sophisticated threat assessment infrastructure had failed to provide it. A 17-year-old in a spider suit had managed it in 11 seconds. It was Thor who finally gave Cabba something he had not realized he was missing until it arrived. 2 days after the Graviton incident, after the meeting request had finally cleared the institutional authorities, bestial course of Avengers protocols and SWORD oversight, and 3 separate legal assessments of what meeting meant in the context of a detained extraterrestrial entity, Thor landed in the facility's exterior yard without announcement, looked at Cabba across 15 meters of cracked concrete, and said nothing for a full 7 seconds. Then, "I watched what you did in that building, the 4 strikes, the bow afterward. Where did you train?" Cabba told him. Thor nodded. Slowly, with the gravity of someone hearing a name attached to a reputation that reached across universes. "Then let us see what you have learned." What followed was not a fight. It was something considerably rarer and more valuable. 2 warriors who respected each other before first contact, exchanging knowledge rather than dominance, testing understanding rather than limits. The monitoring equipment spent 3 hours recording numbers it had no established scale for. And somewhere in the network of sensors and analysts and intelligence streams feeding into Fury's private terminal, a quiet alarm activated. Not a threat alarm, not a containment alert, but a category Fury had created years ago for a very specific type of situation. He called it, in his own internal notation, the variable that changes everything. He had activated it exactly 4 times in 30 years. This was the 5th. Peter Parker had a gift that no intelligence agency in Marvel's universe had ever successfully replicated, despite several documented attempts. He could talk to people, not debrief them, not strategically extract information from them while performing conversation, not run a parallel threat assessment behind friendly eye contact. Actually talk to them with the specific, unguarded sincerity of someone who had never fully learned to be calculating about human connection and had, at this point in his life, largely stopped trying. SWORD had run 48 hours of structured interrogation on Cabba and produced a file full of accurate facts and 0 genuine understanding. Peter Parker sat cross-legged on a table across from him, ate half a sandwich he had brought from a bodega 3 blocks away, and within 20 minutes knew things about Cabba that no formal process had surfaced. Not because he was smarter than the analysts, because he asked different questions. Not what are you and what do you want and who sent you? He asked, what is your home like? Do you have people waiting for you? What does it feel like to be somewhere you did not choose? Simple questions. The kind that bypass strategy entirely and land directly in the part of a person that was never prepared to be interrogated because it never expected to matter to anyone. What Peter learned in 2 hours reframed everything. Cabba was not a scout, not an advance unit, not a displaced weapon or a cosmic variable or any of the 17 threat classifications SWORD had been rotating through its assessment framework since his arrival. He was a person who had been in the wrong place at the moment a dimensional rupture decided to be indiscriminate, separated from everything familiar, and deposited in a universe that had responded to his presence by pointing weapons at him and putting him in a white room. He missed home. He was worried. Not anxious, not destabilized, but genuinely and specifically worried about the people under his protection in Universe 6, the ones whose safety was his responsibility, and who were now without him for an indeterminate period through no fault of either party. He was frustrated by the containment not because it threatened him, but because it was wasteful. Every hour in that room was an hour not spent doing something useful. Peter recognized that frustration immediately, from the inside, the way you only recognize things you have personally lived. He texted Happy Hogan from under the table. He's not a threat. He's basically us, but from space, and why we... with better posture. Happy did not respond. Tony Stark, whose monitoring systems included Happy Hogan's text messages in situations classified as active threat assessments, read it within 4 minutes. Stark authorized the provisional release 36 hours later, not because of Peter's text, officially, though unofficially the text had moved something in a risk calculus that 17 intelligence reports had failed to shift. The official reasoning was the energy analysis, specifically the self-limiting signature. Stark had spent 2 days running every diagnostic framework he had against that signature, trying to find the mechanism, understand the architecture, determine whether it was genuine restraint or sophisticated concealment. What he found was that it was neither, or rather, it was both in a way that made the distinction meaningless. It was not a switch Cabba was consciously flipping. It was structural, trained into him at a level below active decision-making, the way breathing was trained into a diver. Not chosen moment to moment, but built into the operating system through enough repetition that it had become the default state. That level of training did not develop accidentally. It did not develop quickly. It was the product of years of deliberate cultivation under someone who understood that power without discipline was not power at all. It was just a disaster with a face. Stark authorized the release and attached one condition: a monitoring bracelet. He knew it was cosmetic. Cabba almost certainly knew it was cosmetic. They both treated it as real, because sometimes the gesture matters more than the function, and the gesture said, "We are trying to extend trust in the direction of a person rather than manage a threat," and that difference was worth maintaining even symbolically. Freedom, even provisional and monitored, changed Cabba's capacity to understand Marvel in ways that the White Room never could have. He moved through the world with the focused, unhurried attention of someone conducting a serious study. Not a tourist cataloging experiences, but a soldier assessing an operational environment. He watched how civilians interacted with enhanced individuals, the specific mixture of fascination and exhaustion in their faces when a superhuman conflict moved through their neighborhood, the way people had developed a particular urban reflex, a ducking and continuing motion, that spoke to how thoroughly they had normalized the abnormal. He watched the news cycles, the political arguments about oversight and registration, and the endlessly deferred question of who had the right to decide what powerful people were allowed to do and under what conditions. He said very little during these observations, but anyone monitoring his biometrics during the political broadcasts would have noticed something the standard threat assessment metrics had no field for: a specific measured sadness, not despair, not contempt, the sadness of someone who had hoped a particular problem would not exist here, and was finding, with each passing day, that it existed here perhaps more thoroughly than anywhere he had been. His first genuine operational collaboration arrived not through any official channel, but through the simple, unglamorous mechanism of being in the right place. A Shield convoy moving an experimental weapons package through a secondary route was ambushed by an enhanced mercenary team. Fast, coordinated, specifically equipped to overwhelm standard response infrastructure. Cabba was 3 blocks away. He was there because a food cart vendor on the corner made what Peter Parker had described as legitimately the best arepa in any universe. I will take my reputation on this. And Cabba had been investigating that claim. He heard the ambush before any alert reached any official system. He moved because movement was what his training produced when people needed help, and he was the person available to provide it. He dismantled the ambush in under 90 seconds. 11 mercenaries neutralized, none critically injured, the convoy intact, and the experimental package undisturbed. When the official SHIELD response team arrived, they found the mercenaries arranged in a neat, easily managed row on the sidewalk, and Cabba crouched beside the convoy commander, drawing a detailed diagram of the ambush formation on the back of a paper bag, explaining the tactical vulnerabilities in their route selection with the specific helpfulness of someone who had noticed a problem and considered it self-evident that you shared what you noticed. The convoy commander filed her after-action report with unusual speed. She included at the bottom 3 words that were not standard report language: "We need him." Thor found him 4 days after that, not through official channels. Thor's relationship with official channels was one of history's more sustained mutual misunderstandings, but through the straightforward method of flying to where his Asgardian instincts directed him and landing, without announcement or ceremony, in front of Cabba mid-morning in an empty training yard where Cabba had established a daily solo practice. They regarded each other across the cracked concrete. 2 warriors shaped by entirely different cosmologies and traditions and histories, separated by every possible biographical detail. and yet carrying, in their posture and their stillness and the complete absence of performed dominance, the same fundamental grammar. Thor spoke first. "I have been thinking about what you said, about where you trained." He paused. "Vegeta's influence is visible in your method, the architecture. Each strike building toward a structural outcome." Cabba looked at him with the specific attention he gave things worth attending to. "You spar?" Thor smiled. Not the broad performance of it, the real one, smaller and more genuine. "I have been waiting for someone worth sparring with since I arrived on this planet." The monitoring equipment in the facility clocked what followed as 3 hours and 40 minutes. The analysts watching the readout spent most of that time recalibrating instruments that had not previously needed recalibration. What those 3 hours produced was not a hierarchy, not a determination of who was stronger or faster or more technically sophisticated, because both of them understood that was not the point, and both of them held back in ways that kept the question deliberately unresolved. What it produced was intelligence, mutual, detailed, the kind that only comes from direct physical exchange between people who are genuinely trying to understand each other rather than defeat each other. Thor learned that Cabba's style was architectural in the way Strange's magic was architectural. Every element part of a larger structural logic, nothing wasted, nothing performed. Cabba learned that Thor's centuries of combat had produced a technical sophistication that his reputation as a blunt instrument completely obscured, that beneath the thunder and the mythology was a fighter of remarkable precision who had simply learned that precision was less cinematic than spectacle and had mostly stopped bothering to demonstrate it to people who would not appreciate the difference. At the end of it, sitting on the fractured concrete in the late afternoon light, Thor said something that landed with the weight of someone speaking from very long and very specific experience. "This universe will try to use you." Cabba held his gaze. "I know." A pause. "What do I do about that?" Thor was quiet for a long time, the quietness of someone consulting a very deep well before answering. He opened his mouth to speak. Every alarm in the facility triggered at once. Not a graduated escalation, all of them simultaneously, the full-spectrum crisis response that indicated something had crossed multiple detection thresholds at the same moment. SWORD's deep space arrays, Wakanda's vibranium resonance network, Strange's instruments in the Sanctum Sanctorum, which had not triggered a full-spectrum alert in 14 months, and a private system, known to exactly one person, maintained by exactly one person, calibrated to detect exactly one type of approach signature, that began screaming in a frequency its creator had hoped never to hear again. Because what had entered Marvel's atmosphere was not a ship, not a conventional energy signature, not anything the standard threat taxonomy had a prepared response for. It was a temporal insertion, precise, deliberate, and targeted, not at a city, not at an institution, but at a single specific individual whose presence in this timeline had, according to calculations run across 10,000 alternate futures, a 94.7% probability of producing irreversible cascade failure in the Marvel continuum within 6 months. Kang the Conqueror had looked at Cabba's arrival and seen a fracture. He had come to close it. And the universe, the cracked, brilliant, exhausted, endlessly complicated universe that had spent 4 days failing to categorize a young Saiyan from Universe 6, had just run out of time to figure out which side of that calculation it stood on. Kang the Conqueror did not arrive angry. That was the detail that unsettled every experienced hero in the emergency assembly more than the arrival itself. Anger was readable. Anger had a tactical signature. Elevated aggression, impulsive targeting, the specific operational sloppiness that came from letting emotion drive decision-making. Kang arrived the way a surgeon arrives at a scheduled procedure, calm, prepared, carrying the particular quiet confidence of someone who has already completed this operation in several other timelines and knows precisely where to make the incision. His temporal insertion materialized across 3 simultaneous coordinates: New York, Wakanda, and the facility where Cabba and Thor were still sitting on cracked concrete when the alarms activated, forming a perfect triangulation grid, not an attack pattern, a measurement. He was not opening a battle, he was completing a calculation. And the calculation had one output, one conclusion, One operational directive that he had run across 10,000 alternate futures and found consistent in 94.7% of them. The Universe 6 Saiyan currently present in the Marvel timeline needed to be removed before the timeline reached the point of irreversible cascade failure. Removed was a clean word. What it meant was not. Strange assembled the response in 4 minutes, a speed that reflected both his organizational capability and the severity of what his instruments were reading. Avengers Core. Thor, already present. A Wakandan strike team patched through encrypted channels, T'Challa's voice carrying the specific composed urgency of a king who had encountered existential threats before and had developed the discipline not to let urgency become panic. And Cabba, who stood at the back of the briefing and listened with the complete cataloging attention he gave to everything that mattered. Strange laid out Khan G's objective without softening it, because softening it would have been a waste of time they did not have. Kang's models project cascade failure in the Marvel timeline within 6 months of your continued presence here. His solution is your elimination. He has not come to negotiate. He has not come to warn. He has run the numbers, reached a conclusion, and arrived to implement it. The room processed this in the specific silence of people absorbing information that is simultaneously clear and impossible to fully accept. Then Tony Stark said, with the exhausted fluency of someone who had been here before in enough variations to have developed a standard response. So, a time-traveling conqueror wants to eliminate our guest because the future is statistically inconvenient. Absolutely standard Tuesday. What are we doing about it? Cabba asked one question. He waited until the tactical discussion had produced its initial framework, waited until the room had moved from absorbing the situation to actively responding to it, and then he asked it quietly, directed at Strange, standing close enough that the question did not carry across the full assembly. Is he right? Strange looked at him directly. The pause before the answer lasted 3 full seconds, which from a man who processed cosmic variables at extraordinary speed was the equivalent of a very long silence. About the timeline destabilizing? Strange said finally. Possibly. About the solution? He shook his head once. Cabba held that exchange in his mind as the briefing concluded and the response teams deployed. Not because the answer reassured him, possibly was not reassurance, but because Strange's possibly contained something more important than certainty would have. It contained honesty. And in a room full of people running threat assessments and tactical calculations and institutional risk analyses, honesty veered without strategic framing was the rarest thing Cabba had encountered since his arrival. He filed it in the category of things worth remembering about this universe, alongside Peter Parker's sincerity and Thor's recognition and the convoy commander's 3 unsolicited words at the bottom of her report. The engagement opened over the Atlantic, Kang deploying temporal constructs, armored soldiers extracted from a dozen conquered timelines, each one optimized for the specific operational context of neutralizing enhanced targets in the Marvel continuum. Simultaneously, he activated suppression fields broadcasting at frequencies calibrated against every energy signature his instruments had classified as primary threat. The suppression fields were technically extraordinary. They worked on Thor, his power compressed to a fraction of its standard output, Mjolnir heavier in his hand than it had been in centuries. They worked on Strange, his spellcasting slowing, the geometric precision of his constructs degrading under the temporal interference. They worked on Stark, 17 system warnings populating his HUD simultaneously, the suit's power management rerouting constantly to compensate for cascading interference. They worked on everyone except Cabba, because Kang's instruments, sophisticated enough to have mapped the energy signatures of every meaningful power source in the Marvel continuum, had been calibrated against every energy type this universe produced. Ki was not in the database. Ki was not gamma. Ki was not cosmic or magical or genetic. Ki was biological will compressed into force. Life energy structured by training into something that moved through technological suppression fields the way water moved through a net. Completely. Without resistance. Without effort. And without any indication that the suppression fields had registered as anything more than a mild change in atmospheric pressure. Cabba entered the construct formation and the Noise of the engagement dropped in a way that several heroes would describe afterward as the most disorienting sensory experience of a collectively very disorienting career. Not silence. The battle continued. Impacts and energy discharge and the deep structural percussion of temporal constructs hitting the water's surface. But beneath all of it, beneath the chaos and the volume and the spectacle, there was a quality to Cabba's movement through the formation that produced something close to quiet around him. He did not fight with fury. He did not fight with spectacle. He moved through the constructs with the same architectural precision that Thor had identified in the sparring yard. Each movement eliminating multiple threats in sequence. Each strike placed not for maximum force, but for maximum structural disruption of the formation's coherence. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the opposite of how Marvel's powerhouses fought. It was not impressive in the way Marvel's power was impressive. Loud, visible, scale-defining. It was something harder to categorize and considerably harder to counter. It was efficient, and efficiency at this level, applied to a formation designed to overwhelm through volume, produced results that looked less like combat and more like a systematic, methodical, completely unhurried dismantling of something that had made the mistake of assuming overwhelming numbers were the same as overwhelming capacity. Kang stopped using constructs. The tactical pivot came fast, faster than most opponents managed it, which was a reminder that whatever else Kang was, he was not static. He was a man who had fought in 10,000 timelines and had survived them all by updating his models faster than his opponents could exploit the gaps. The new approach was not physical, it was ontological. Temporal pressure waves, targeted not at Cabba's body, not at his combat capability, not at any measurable external feature of his presence, but at his timeline anchor. The specific cosmic mechanism maintaining his material coherence in this universe. Each wave degraded it incrementally, not damaging him in any conventional sense, but fraying the fundamental thread of his existence in this continuum, threatening to dissolve his physical presence not through force, but through something considerably more absolute. Erasure. Cabba felt it as a sensation he had no previous reference for. Not pain in any register he had experienced, but something beneath pain, something that operated below the physical level where pain lived, a pulling at something deeper than tissue or bone or energy. The thread of being here. And for the first time since his arrival in Marvel's universe, his composure showed a fracture, not fear, not rage, something quieter and more devastating than either. The expression of someone realizing that what they are facing is not trying to defeat them, it is trying to unmake them. That expression, visible on the monitoring feeds, visible to every hero in the engagement, visible across the distance to Thor who had been fighting through his own suppression field constraints, broke the tactical hesitation that professional assessment had been maintaining. Not because the heroes had been indifferent, because they were trained, all of them, to evaluate situations before committing fully, to preserve capacity, to make the strategically sound choice about when and how to expend resources. That training evaporated the moment they saw Cabba's face. Steve Rogers moved first. Not because his capacity against Kang's temporal technology was significant, it was not, but because Rogers' body had a deeply trained and essentially unoverridable response to watching someone be slowly erased while the people around them calculated the optimal moment to help. Tony rerouted every system in the suit toward temporal frequency disruption, abandoning every other function, the suit going dark in all non-essential areas as its full power redirected toward a single purpose. Thor went directly for Kang. Not the constructs, not the suppression fields, not the tactical infrastructure, but Kang himself, Mjolnir carrying the accumulated fury of a warrior who recognized, in the most ancient and unarguable part of his Asgardian inheritance, that what Kang was doing had a name older than tactics. It was execution, dressed in mathematics. And then Cabba stopped retreating from the temporal pressure waves and turned directly into them. What he released in that moment was not technique, it was not strategy, it was not the calibrated, self-limiting, architecturally precise force that every sensor in Marvel's monitoring infrastructure had cataloged and analyzed and filed under extraordinary but manageable. What he released was will. Pure, structured, burning with the specific intensity of a person who has decided, with complete clarity and zero ambiguity, that they are not going to be unmade by a universe that has not yet finished showing them what it is. Every temporal pressure wave Kang had been building, stacking, layering against the threat of Cabba's existence in this continuum, they buckled. Not gradually, not in the incremental way that structures fail under sustained load. They buckled the way things buckle when the fundamental premise underlying them turns out to be wrong. Kang's instruments spiked into ranges they had never recorded. His models, 10,000 timelines of accumulated calculation, produced an output his systems flagged as null, meaning not that the result was zero, but that the result was outside the boundaries of what his models had been built to contain. Strange, watching from the edge of the engagement, felt something shift in the fabric of the continuum around them. Not the destabilization Kang had predicted, something stranger. Something that, when he filed his assessment afterward and spent 3 days trying to find the right classification for it, he ultimately described in his personal notes with 2 words that he did not include in the official report because they were not sufficiently technical. Recognition. The universe, he wrote, seemed to recognize him. Not as a threat, not as an anomaly, as something it had needed without knowing it was missing. And in the cold Atlantic air above a battle that had just fundamentally changed its own terms, a young Saiyan from Universe 6 stood in the middle of the wreckage of Kang's calculations and breathed steadily and waited to see what the universe he had refused to leave was going to do next. Kang retreated, not in defeat. Understanding that distinction matters enormously, because Kang the Conqueror did not experience defeat in any conventional sense, and applying that word to what happened over the Atlantic would be both inaccurate and dangerously reassuring. He retreated because his models had produced a null result. And a null result, in Kang's operational language, did not mean failure. It meant the fundamental premise of the calculation was wrong, that the variable he had inserted into his timeline projection as destabilizing anomaly was not behaving as a destabilizing anomaly, and that continuing to treat it as one, while it continued to not be one, was the specific kind of tactical inflexibility that got conquerors killed. In timelines, they had already survived 17 times. He stepped back through his temporal insertion point with the composed deliberateness of a chess player removing a piece from a position that no longer served the game. He would recalculate. He would return. But he would return with different models, and the fact that Cabba's presence had forced Kang the Conqueror, a man who had mapped 10,000 futures, to rebuild his models from scratch was, in its own quiet way, the most significant thing that had happened in the Marvel timeline in a very long time. The aftermath of the engagement settled over the city the way Marvel's aftermaths always did. Gradually, loudly, and with a volume of institutional paperwork that bore no proportional relationship to the actual significance of what had occurred. Structural assessments, temporal displacement mapping, 3 separate CIELD unit debriefs, a press statement carefully worded to describe a contained dimensional incursion in language that conveyed authority while revealing nothing. Tony ran diagnostics for 6 hours and drank an amount of coffee that Friday flagged as medically inadvisable. All of it proceeded with the exhausted professional efficiency that Marvel's infrastructure had developed across decades of cleaning up after things that should not have happened and did anyway. But beneath the mechanical recovery, in the conversations between individuals rather than institutions, in the specific things people said and did not say to each other in the hours after Cabba had turned into a temporal erasure field and refused to dissolve, the real resolution was taking shape. Quieter than the battle, more durable than any tactical assessment, and considerably more uncomfortable for everyone who had spent the past week managing Cabba as a variable rather than knowing him as a person. Steve Rogers found him on a rooftop. Not the facility rooftop. Cabba had, in the provisional freedom following the engagement, developed a clear preference for elevated open spaces that anyone who had spent 72 hours in a white room would have found entirely understandable. Rogers arrived without announcement, which Cabba had come to recognize as the specific form of respect Rogers extended to people he considered worth respecting. He did not perform his arrivals, did not lead with his significance, simply appeared and was present in the straightforward way of someone who had learned, across a very long and complicated life, that presence was more valuable than entrance. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city's recovery operation below. The cranes and the emergency vehicles and the small, determined human machinery of putting things back together after something large had knocked them down. Rogers said eventually, "You didn't have to turn into that. You could have retreated." Cabba considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Where would I retreat to?" he said. "This is the only universe I currently have." Rogers was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A short, genuine sound, the laugh of someone hearing their own situation described from an angle they had not previously considered. "Yeah," he said, "I know exactly how that feels." The institutional response moved on its own timeline, which was slower and more complicated than any human timeline, and produced results that were, depending on which institution you consulted, entirely contradictory. SWORD filed 3 separate threat reassessment reports within 48 hours of the engagement. The first classified Cabba as an asset of unprecedented operational value. The second classified him as a long-term existential variable, requiring continuous monitoring and containment protocols. The third, authored by a senior analyst who had been in the monitoring room when Kang's temporal pressure waves buckled against Cabba's key output and who had spent the subsequent 12 hours doing nothing but reviewing the data from that moment, classified him in language that broke from standard threat assessment format entirely. It said, "Subject falls outside current institutional framework. Recommend policy development rather than threat response categorization." That report was the only one Fury read twice. He did not distribute it. He placed it in a personal file, his equivalent of a locked drawer, which in Fury's operational language meant he was taking it seriously enough to think about it alone before deciding what to do with it, which was, for anyone who understood how Fury processed things he considered genuinely important, the highest possible form of acknowledgement his system was capable of producing. T'Challa's response arrived through different channels and reached different conclusions because T'Challa was not running a threat assessment. He was running a character assessment, which was a different instrument entirely and one that Marvel's intelligence infrastructure had largely forgotten how to use. He had watched the full engagement through Wakandan surveillance arrays, not the tactical summary, the full unedited feed, and what he had focused on was not the power output or the temporal wave resistance or the null result in Kang's models. He had focused on the 30 seconds after the engagement ended, when the constructs were down and Kang had retreated and the immediate crisis had passed and Cabba was standing in the quiet Atlantic air, alone for a moment before the other heroes reached him. What Cabba did in those 30 seconds was nothing dramatic. He checked the horizon. He checked the water surface for anything that needed immediate attention. He verified, visibly and demethodically, that nothing in the immediate environment required further action. Then he stood still, breathing steadily, completely alone in the aftermath of something that had nearly unmade him, and looked, not shaken, not triumphant, not relieved, simply present, ready for whatever came next. T'Challa watched that 30 seconds 4 times. Then he composed a message and sent it directly, bypassing every official channel, to the communication device Shuri had confirmed was being monitored on Cabba's behalf. It said, "When you are ready to understand this world fully, come to Wakanda. We will show you what strength looks like when it has never had to apologize for itself." Dr. Strange closed the threat assessment file he had maintained on Cabba since the moment the impossible energy signature had registered in the upper atmosphere 12 days ago. He closed it not because the situation had resolved. Strange was professionally and constitutionally allergic to premature resolution, and nothing about this situation had resolved in any clean or final sense. He closed it because the category was wrong. He had filed it under anomaly, potential destabilizing influence, which had been the correct initial categorization given the available information and which had been comprehensively contradicted by every piece of information gathered since. He reopened the file under a different classification, one he maintained for a very small number of cases, used rarely and with great deliberateness. Necessary variable. The distinction was cosmically significant. An anomaly was something the continuum needed to correct. A necessary variable was something the continuum had produced, or in this case admitted, for a reason it had not yet finished articulating. Strange had been wrong about which one Cabba was. He sat with that wrongness for a while, examining it with the honest curiosity he tried to apply to his own errors, and found something unexpected. It did not bother him. The specific quality of being wrong in the direction of underestimating something good was, in his experience, among the more tolerable forms of intellectual failure. And Cabba. How had 12 days in Marvel's universe changed him? The honest answer was, not in the ways that would have registered on any instrument SWORD had run or any assessment Stark had filed. His power was the same. His discipline was intact. His principles had not bent under containment, institutional suspicion, temporal erasure, or the specific grinding pressure of a universe that communicated primarily through threat classifications and oversight committees. But something had shifted in his understanding, not of himself, but of what his principles cost in environments that did not share them. He had arrived believing that strength should protect. He was still leaving, or staying, the question remained genuinely open, with that belief completely intact. What he had added to it was harder and more specific. He now understood that in some universes, protection was not a simple act but a sustained argument, that being strong enough to protect was only the beginning, that you also had to be strong enough to keep insisting, against every institutional reflex to the contrary, that the people you were protecting were people and not variables. That was a different kind of strength than anything his training had formally addressed. And it was, he was beginning to understand, the kind that Marvel needed most and had the most difficulty producing in the beings it most needed to carry it. So here is where this part of the story lands. Not at resolution, because Marvel does not resolve, it accumulates. Cabba had moved through 12 days of this universe's most concentrated institutional, philosophical, and existential pressure and had emerged from it recognizably himself. That was not a small thing. This was a universe that had taken brilliant, principled people and ground them over years and decades into functional compromises of what they had originally been. It had not done that to Cabba in 12 days. Whether it could do it in 12 months or 12 years, or whether something in his foundational architecture was genuinely resistant to the process, that was the question sitting in the middle of every conversation about him, in every institutional file and personal assessment and quiet individual reckoning that his presence had generated. And the most uncomfortable version of that question, the one that Fury turned over in private, that Strange examined in the Sanctum's silence, that Rogers sat with on the rooftop after Cabba had gone back inside, was not really about Cabba at all. It was about them. If a Saiyan from a universe none of them had heard of could arrive here and remain entirely himself under conditions that had reshaped all of them, then what exactly was Marvel's excuse? Drop your answer in the comments, because I think you already know it, and I think it is the most important question this universe has asked itself in a very long time. There is a specific frequency that broken things emit, not a sound exactly, more like a quality in the air, a background vibration that you stop consciously registering after enough exposure because your nervous system reclassifies it from signal to environment. Marvel's cities ran on that frequency. Cabba had been absorbing it since the moment he landed, the particular hum of a civilization perpetually mid-repair, perpetually processing its most recent catastrophe while bracing for the next one. He had not had a name for it until he crossed into Wakandan airspace, and it simply stopped. The holographic camouflage dissolved ahead of him at T'Challa's authorization, and what materialized beneath it hit sea. Abba with a force that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with recognition. Not the technology, though the technology was extraordinary by any universe's standard, vibranium architecture catching and redistributing morning light in patterns that felt less like engineering and more like a civilization thinking out loud. What stopped him mid-flight for a full 10 seconds was the quality of the silence. This place did not hum with recovery. It hummed with something older and steadier, the specific frequency of a people who had been allowed, across centuries, to become exactly what they chose to be. He had not realized, until that moment, how much weight he had been carrying. Not physical weight. That category was largely irrelevant for a Saiyan at his level. The other kind. The accumulated atmospheric pressure of existing inside a system that processed him, daily and consistently, as a problem requiring management. Every interaction in Marvel's institutional infrastructure carried it. The careful language, the monitoring equipment, the provisional qualifiers attached to every extension of trust, the omnipresent subtext that said, "We believe you," pending further evidence, subject to review, contingent on continued compliance. He had moved through it without complaint because complaining served no purpose and because Vegeta had not trained him to mistake discomfort for damage. But discomfort and damage were different things, and what Cabba understood, descending through Wakandan airspace toward a city that had never been asked to justify its own existence, was that he had been accumulating the former at a rate his training had categorized as manageable, and his instincts had been quietly flagging as something else entirely. T'Challa received him in a hall open to the sky, vibranium columns framing a view of the city below, the architecture deliberate in the way that spaces designed for significant conversations are deliberate, every element considered rather than merely constructed. The Black Panther stood without ceremony. No guards positioned for visible effect, no formal protocol establishing hierarchy before content, none of the performative staging that Marvel's institutional meetings had taught Cabba to expect as standard operating procedure. Just T'Challa, composed, direct, carrying the specific gravity of someone who had nothing to prove and had reached that position through substance rather than performance. They regarded each other across the space, and what passed between them in that regard was the thing that words typically obscure rather than convey. A mutual assessment conducted at the level where character reads character without requiring a formal introduction. T'Challa spoke first. "I watched you refuse to be erased." A pause, precise and weighted. Not just the temporal resistance. Afterward, when it was over, you checked the horizon before you checked yourself. Cabba held his gaze. There were still people in the water. T'Challa nodded once, the nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already understood. "Come," he said. "There are things here you should see." The Dora Milaje assessed him on the second morning, and their assessment was the most honest professional evaluation Cabba had received since his arrival in Marvel's universe. Not because it was kind. It was not designed to be kind, it was designed to be accurate. They watched him train alone at dawn with the complete, undemonstrative attention of soldiers who took their craft seriously enough to observe everything and perform nothing. No posturing, no territorial displays, no engineers. Moments of dominance designed to establish a hierarchy before the work began. They simply watched, with the quality of attention that only develops in people who have spent years understanding that the difference between surviving and not surviving often lives in the details that casual observation misses. When he finished, Okoye approached. She was not hurrying, she was not softening anything. She looked at his stance with the specific eye of someone who had spent decades refining her own and said, with the clean directness of a person who respected him too much to be polite about it, "Your feet are wrong. Left heel too high. You are loading the right side for a strike you have already decided to make before the situation requires it. Not a challenge, not a test, a correction. The kind you only offer someone you consider worth correcting." Cabba adjusted. She watched, nodded once. They trained together for 2 hours. Neither of them spoke again. It was, by a significant margin, the most useful conversation he had in Wakanda. Shuri arrived on the third day with a tablet, 17 questions, and the specific energetic impatience of someone for whom the distance between curiosity and investigation had been reduced through years of practice to approximately 0. She ran analyses on his key that produced results she described, with complete scientific sincerity, as deeply personally offensive, meaning they violated principles she had previously considered settled in ways that required either a fundamental revision of her models or the conclusion that the universe had been withholding information she deserved to have. She asked questions at a speed that most people found overwhelming, and that Cabba found unexpectedly refreshing, because the speed was not aggression. It was enthusiasm, and enthusiasm was something Marvel's institutional processing of him had contained almost no trace of. She wanted to understand, not to classify. She wanted to know how Kai functioned, not what threat level it represented. That difference, between curiosity oriented toward understanding and curiosity oriented toward control, was the difference between every previous interaction Cabba had navigated in this universe and this one. He answered her questions with matching directness. By the end of the second hour, she had filled the tablet and was writing on her arm. What Wakanda provided that nowhere else in Marvel had managed was the rarest possible gift for someone in Cabba's position: context without agenda. T'Challa walked with him through the Great Mound and spoke about vibranium not as a resource or a strategic asset or a geopolitical variable, but as a responsibility, something their ancestors had been given stewardship of and had spent generations learning to deserve. The distinction between having something and deserving it, between power as possession and power as obligation, was one Cabba understood at the most fundamental level of his training, and hearing it articulated here, in a civilization that had built its entire identity around that distinction, produced something he had not expected. Not comfort exactly, more specific than comfort, the specific relief of a person who has been speaking a language in isolation for weeks and has finally encountered someone fluent in it. He said at one point, interrupting T'Challa mid-sentence with an abruptness that surprised them both. In Universe 6, we call it the same thing. Not the word, the idea. That strength is not what you have. It is what you choose to do with it when nothing is forcing you to choose correctly. T'Challa was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, exactly that. And the difficulty is that no system can teach it. It has to be built by the person, or it does not hold." The archive hit him differently than anything else in Wakanda. T'Challa brought him there on the 4th day. The historical record of every external threat Wakanda had navigated. Every moment its strength had been tested. Every king who had faced the specific impossible choice between protection and exposure and had to decide, with incomplete information and real consequences, which form of failure was more acceptable. Cabba sat with it for 3 hours. Not the battles. He understood battles. What he sat with were the gaps between battles, the long stretches of historical record that documented the cost of carrying power in a world that misunderstood it. The kings who had watched the world suffer at distances that Wakanda's isolation had maintained deliberately, and who had run the calculation, intervene and risk exposure, abstain and accept complicity, over and over, across generations, never arriving at a clean answer because the clean answer did not exist. He recognized that calculation. He had watched Vegeta make versions of it. He had made versions of it himself, in Universe 6, in the Tournament of Power, in every moment where the question was not can I act, but what does acting cost, and who pays the cost that isn't me? That question did not belong to any single universe. It was the specific and permanent burden of anyone whose choices had consequences beyond themselves. Wakanda had been carrying it for centuries. Cabba had been carrying it for the duration of his time in Marvel. The archive told him, without saying it directly, that the weight did not get lighter. You just got stronger. He left on the 5th morning, not because the welcome had ended. T'Challa had communicated through every available means, none of them verbal, that Cabba's presence was not contingent on schedule or convenience. He left because 5 days of Wakandan stillness had clarified something that needed clarification before it could be acted on. He understood now what his time in Marvel required of him. Not what the institutions wanted from him. Not what the heroes needed him to be. Not what the oversight committees were going to spend months trying to formalize into a policy framework. What the universe itself, in its cracked and brilliant and exhausted actuality, needed from the specific person who had arrived in it. He rose from Wakandan soil in the early light and turned toward the horizon where 3 separate crisis signals were already registering on the device Shuri had pressed into his hand that morning, along with 12 pages of key analysis notes and a single handwritten line at the bottom that said, "Come back when you have more data. I have 17 more questions." He flew toward the largest signal first, not because it was the most strategically significant, because the largest signal meant the most people in the most immediate danger, and that calculation had never required more than a second of his time. This was what he had been trained for. This was what he was. And somewhere behind him, watching his departure from a balcony above the morning city, T'Challa stood with his hands folded and felt something he had not felt since the last time he had watched someone carry strength the right way. Not pride exactly, though it resembled pride. More like recognition. The specific, rare, deeply satisfying recognition of something in the world being exactly what it was supposed to be. The signal Shuri's device flagged as largest was not the loudest. That distinction matters. Loud signals in Marvel's universe were common. Explosions, energy discharges, enhanced individuals making the specific category of large decision that produced visible shockwaves and network news cover us. G within minutes. This signal was quiet. A biological anomaly alert, civilian band frequency originating from coordinates in Eastern Europe that corresponded to a facility that did not exist on any public infrastructure map, and that SHIELD's official records listed under the category of decommissioned, non-operational, archived. 17 life signatures. Acute physiological distress. Compression patterns in the key readouts that Cabba had learned in the weeks since his arrival to translate with increasing accuracy, not through any instrument, but through the specific sensitivity of someone who had spent years learning to read the difference between a flame burning freely and a flame being systematically starved of air. These 17 signatures were the second kind. Something in a building that officially did not exist was doing something to 17 people that it did not want anyone to know about. And the reason it did not want anyone to know about it was the first thing Cabba understood, descending through Eastern European cloud cover in the early morning gray, before he had seen a single wall of the facility. The reason was that the people responsible were not criminals operating outside the system. They were the system. The facility's exterior was deliberately unremarkable, the specific aesthetic of infrastructure designed to be looked at without being seen, gray concrete and chain link, and the universal visual language of industrial, unimportant, move along. Cabba landed on the outer wall and paused, not hesitation, assessment. He read the security architecture the way he read combat formations, identifying the structural logic, the layered responses, the specific sequence of systems that would activate in what order when the perimeter registered a breach. He wanted them to know something was coming. This was a deliberate choice, and it was worth understanding why. He could have entered without triggering a single sensor. His control was precise enough, his understanding of key suppression refined enough through weeks of operating in a universe full of detection systems. He chose not to suppress. He chose instead to let every sensor in the building register his arrival simultaneously, because the people responsible for those 17 compressed signatures needed something specific before he reached them. They needed enough time to understand that what was coming toward them had noticed what they were doing. That was not cruelty. That was information, delivered in the only language institutional wrongdoing consistently understood, the language of consequence becoming real. He moved through the security response in 4 minutes and 13 seconds. The details of how are less important than the details of what he maintained throughout. Because what he maintained, in a building full of armed personnel operating an illegal program on enhanced individuals, was the same self-limiting precision that Tony Stark had first identified in the Graviton footage and had spent weeks trying to fully explain to himself. Nobody died. Nobody would require more than medical attention, some recovery time, and a significant professional reconsideration of the choices that had brought them to this building on this morning. He did not make it brutal. He did not make it theatrical. He made it fast and clear and calibrated. The response of a warrior who understood that the personnel in this facility were not the architecture of the problem, they were the current occupants of it, and that dismantling the architecture required leaving the occupants conscious enough to be accountable for what they had chosen to participate in. That distinction between punishing people and removing them from the ability to continue causing harm was the kind Cabba's Tio. Reigning had made structural. It was also, he was increasingly aware, the kind that Marvel's punitive reflex consistently collapsed. The detention level stopped him. Not physically. Nothing in the facility had the capacity to stop him physically, and several things had already demonstrated that fact. It stopped him in the way that certain images stop people who have been moving fast through difficult situations. Suddenly, completely, with the specific force of something that bypasses the operational layer and lands directly in the part of you that processes meaning rather than tactics. 17 people in various states of experimental distress, some conscious, tracking his arrival with the particular quality of attention that people develop when they have learned not to trust new arrivals because new arrivals have consistently meant something worse was beginning. Some not conscious, their Chi signatures present but reduced to the irregular low-burning frequency of people whose systems were operating on reserve because the standard resources had been depleted by sustained external interference. all of them carrying the specific hollow quality that Cabba associated, from training and from everything he had witnessed in Universe 6 and beyond, with people who had been systematically reminded that their power made them property. He stood in that corridor and did not move for a moment that was longer internally than any clock would have recorded it, because this was not a villain's operation. That was what sat in his chest like cold weight as he looked at what had been done here. This was an authorized operation. The paperwork existed. The chain of command existed. The institutional signature on the program that had produced these 17 people in this corridor existed. And it traced back, through several carefully constructed layers of operational distance, to organizations that also authorized convoy protection and deployed personnel against Kang, and sent representatives to Avengers briefings and used words like security and protection and defense of human life with complete, practiced sincerity. The same machinery, the same signature, producing both. He got them out. That part was straightforward in its execution and devastating in its texture, carrying those who could not move, steadying those who could, moving 17 people through a compromised building with the specific combination of physical capability and deliberate gentleness that the situation required. He brought them 3 kilometers from the facility and contacted Strange directly, because Strange was the one person in Marvel's institutional ecosystem whose moral judgment operated with genuine independence from his institutional affiliation, who had access to the infrastructure needed for medical response without the reflex to subordinate human cost to operational management. Strange arrived within minutes and took over the medical coordination with focused competence, his expression carrying the specific controlled anger of someone who was very good at not letting anger interfere with immediate necessity. They worked alongside each other in near silence. At one point, Strange looked across the group of survivors at Cabba and said, quietly enough that only Cabba heard it, "This is what I meant when I said possibly." Cabba looked at him. "About the timeline," Strange continued. "About whether Kang was right. He was right that your finding this would create instability. He was wrong about whether instability, in this case, was too a problem." The institutional explosion arrived within 48 hours, which was faster than Cabba had expected and considerably more comprehensive. He had no operational standing in European territory. He had no authorization from any recognized oversight body. He had no chain of command, no formal mission directive, no legal framework within which his actions could be classified as sanctioned intervention rather than unilateral extraterritorial breach of approximately 11 distinct operational protocols. He had done what he had done because 17 people were being harmed in a building that officially did not exist, and the question of whether he was authorized to object to that had not entered his processing. It had not entered his processing because it was not a question his foundational architecture recognized as valid. You did not require authorization to object to harm. You required capacity and proximity and the willingness to pay the cost of acting. He had all 3. He acted. The argument about authorization was, from his perspective, a conversation that could only meaningfully happen among people who had collectively agreed that the process of obtaining permission was more important than the harm occurring while permission was being sought. He did not share that agreement. He was beginning to understand that this disagreement was not a minor cultural difference between his universe and Marvel's. It was the central fault line. Everything else was surface. The formal review convened 5 days later. Cabba attended without legal representation, which produced visible anxiety in several committee members who understood, in ways their official role prevented them from stating directly, that what they were conducting was not a genuine accountability process, but an institutional, face-saving exercise dressed in procedural language. He sat before 11 representatives of various oversight bodies and answered every question with the same unstrategic honesty he had brought to every formal interaction since his arrival. Complete, unembellished, carrying no protective framing whatsoever. When asked whether he understood he had violated operational protocols, he said yes. When asked whether he would repeat the action under identical circumstances, he said yes. When asked to justify that position within the framework of established oversight principles, he said something that produced 8 full seconds of silence in a room professionally calibrated to process difficult statements without visible reaction. In my universe, we have one principle that sits above all operational frameworks. Power exists to protect, Not systems, not institutions, not the process by which institutions manage their relationship with power. People. When the system and the people it claims to protect are pointing in different directions, I protect the people. I don't know how to present that as more complicated than it is, and I don't think making it more complicated would make it more true. 8 seconds. The kind of silence that does not indicate confusion. The kind that indicates that something has been said that everyone in the room already knew, and nobody had previously been willing to say in a formal setting without qualification. The committee did not resolve Cabba's operational status that day. Marvel's committees were not designed for resolution. They were designed for management, which was different and slower and produced outcomes that were carefully worded to satisfy multiple conflicting institutional requirements simultaneously while committing fully to none of them. But something shifted in the informal architecture after that hearing. Something below the level of policy in the layer where individuals processed things privately before they became institutional positions. Steve Rogers changed 3 operational protocols in the following week, quietly, without announcement, each one moving incrementally toward the principle Cabba had stated plainly in that room. Tony Stark filed a private memo, addressed to nobody, saved to a personal server, the kind of document that was less communication and more thinking out loud. That began. The problem with having someone around who says the obvious true thing without apology is that it makes the rest of us look like we chose not to. Peter Parker texted Cabba that evening. I heard what you said in there. The whole city heard what you said in there. Also, I found a better Arepa place. This is critical information. And Fury, reading the transcript alone in private at 0200 hours, sat with the 8-second silence marked in the audio record and did not write anything in the margin. Because what Cabba had said in that room was not new information. Every person in that building had known it for years. The thing that Fury sat with, the thing that kept the transcript open on his screen longer than his standard processing time, was simpler and considerably more unsettling than any tactical assessment he had filed this month. A young Saiyan from a universe none of them had heard of had walked into a formal oversight hearing and said the true thing clearly, without strategy, without fear, and without the slightest indication that he understood it was supposed to be complicated. And the most damning part was not that he had said it. The most damning part was that not one person in that room had been able to tell him he was wrong. There is a specific loneliness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive as absence, as the obvious, nameable pain of being without people or purpose or place. It arrives as presence, as the specific experience of being surrounded by people who need you, institutions that want you, factions that are actively competing for your allegiance, and finding, beneath all of that density of attention, a persistent, quiet, structurally unresolvable gap between being useful and being understood. Marvel's heroes knew this loneliness with the intimacy of long acquaintance. Tony Stark had built an armor around his, layer by layer, until the armor was so sophisticated that most people could no longer locate where the protection ended and the person began. Steve Rogers had converted his into fuel, pouring it continuously into mission and duty and the forward momentum of purpose, because stillness was when it became loudest. Thor had centuries of practice carrying it as a familiar weight, the specific gravity of someone whose scale of experience had always exceeded the available company. They had all found methods, functional, hard-won, costly methods. What none of them had found, what the entire accumulated brilliance and tragedy of Marvel's hero infrastructure had never quite managed to produce, was a way to make the loneliness unnecessary. Cabba had not solved it either, but something about watching him move through their world, present, disciplined, entirely himself, had started a question in the back of several minds that was more uncomfortable than any threat assessment Kang had generated. What if it did not have to be this way? The question of where Cabba operationally belonged in Marvel's architecture had been generating institutional paperwork since the morning after the oversight hearing, and the paperwork was distinguished primarily by the quality of its contradiction. SWORD wanted him registered under the Enhanced Individual Monitoring Protocol, a framework designed for beings whose power exceeded standard containment thresholds, which Cabba technically satisfied, and which would have placed him under continuous reporting obligations and geographic restrictions that he would have found, at best, operationally inconvenient and, at worst, structurally identical to the containment cell he had started in. The Avengers wanted him operating under their coordination framework, not from malice, and the distinction between not from malice and not a problem was one Cabba had developed significant precision about during his time here. Coordination frameworks were built by organizations that had learned, through experience, that uncoordinated, powerful individuals produced expensive, unpredictable outcomes. The logic was sound. The application of that logic to someone whose foundational principle was, I protect people when they need protecting, regardless of whether I have filed the appropriate advance notice, was the kind of category error that sounded reasonable in a briefing room and collapsed immediately on contact with actual situations. Strange wanted something harder to institutionalize. He wanted Cabba accessible, available for the category of cosmic consultation that arose when the problems exceeding standard Avengers scope began their approach, without being absorbed into the machinery that tended, over time and through the gradual accumulation of reasonable operational requests, to convert exceptional individuals into specialized components. He had watched it happen too many times. Brilliant, principled people arriving in Marvel's orbit with full moral clarity and leaving years later with a set of carefully negotiated compromises they had made so incrementally that each individual step had seemed reasonable and the cumulative distance had become visible only in retrospect. Strange did not want that for Cabba, and his reasons were not entirely altruistic. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that, he did not want it because Marvel needed, with some urgency, at least one person in its operational ecosystem who had not yet made the compromises, who still knew what the original position felt like from the inside, who could say the true thing in the oversight hearing without qualification. You could not manufacture that quality once it was gone. You could only protect it while it existed. The people who tried to solve the belonging question by converting it into a symbol problem arrived on a Tuesday. A delegation representing a coalition of enhanced rights advocacy organizations who had watched the oversight hearing footage, watched the facility exposure story move through public consciousness with the specific velocity of something that confirmed what many people had already suspected, and concluded with the logical clarity of people whose work required them to think in terms of leverage and narrative, that Cabba was the most powerful advocacy asset their movement had encountered in a decade. They were not wrong about the facts. What had happened in that facility was real. What Cabba had said in that hearing was true. The gap between Marvel's institutional rhetoric about protecting enhanced individuals and its actual institutional practice regarding enhanced individuals was exactly as large as the Coalition's documentation suggested. The cause was just, their theory of change was coherent, and the specific request they brought to the table, that Cabba become the public face, the central figure, the narrative anchor for their campaign, was the kind of request that sounded like opportunity and functioned like a trap, and Cabba identified the trap within the first 8 minutes of the meeting with the specific clarity of someone who had been paying very close attention to how Marvel's universe operated for 3 weeks. He did not refuse immediately. That choice, to O-site with the request, examine it seriously, ask questions before responding, was itself information about him that most people in the room were not reading correctly. Several delegation members interpreted the lack of immediate refusal as receptivity. What it actually was, for anyone who had spent enough time observing Cabba to understand his processing method, was respect. The same respect that had led him to comply with SWORD containment, to sit patiently through 48 hours of interrogation, to attend the oversight hearing without legal representation. He took things seriously by engaging with them fully before responding. He asked about the Coalition's organizational structure. He asked about their methods, specifically the distinction between their public-facing communications and their internal operational decisions, because that gap, in his experience, was where you found out whether an organization's stated values and its actual values were the same thing. He asked who made decisions and how dissent was handled and what happened to people who disagreed with the strategic direction. The delegation had prepared answers for questions about Cabba's potential involvement. They had not prepared answers for questions about themselves. The discomfort that produced was, from Cabba's perspective, useful information. The answer came when one delegation member, senior, strategic, clearly the architect of the approach, described the proposal using a specific phrase. Strategic deployment of your moral authority. Cabba stopped the conversation, not loudly, not with anger, with the specific quality of stillness that, in his presence, functioned more effectively than volume. "I am not a deployment," he said. The room absorbed this. "I am a person. My moral positions are not authority to be leveraged. They are conclusions I arrived at through experience and training, and they belong to me. If you want my participation in your work, it must be as a participant who makes his own decisions about what he says and when and why, not as a figure whose image you operate to support a strategy I did not design." 3 delegation members looked uncomfortable in the specific way of people encountering a boundary they had not anticipated. 2 looked like they had just heard something they would be thinking about significantly longer than the meeting lasted. The senior strategist looked, briefly, like someone recalculating from scratch. Good, Cabba thought. Recalculation was the honest response to new information. It was what he had been doing since the moment he arrived in this universe. He had no objection to others doing the same. Peter Parker found him on the rooftop that evening, the east-facing one, the one with the view of the city's recovery construction still running under floodlights because the timeline on the Kang-related structural damage had not accommodated normal working hours. Peter arrived without his mask, which Cabba had come to understand was the specific gesture of trust that Peter extended to people he had decided were worth the exposure. Not the physical exposure, which was its own complicated calculation, but the more significant one, the removal of the performance layer, the choice to be a person rather than a symbol in someone's presence. They sat and watched the construction below, and Peter said, without preamble or setup, "You're trying to figure out if you can stay here without the staying changing who you are." Cabba looked at him. "Yes," he said. Peter nodded, slowly, with the specific gravity of someone who had been working on the same problem for years and had not yet solved it, but had learned some things worth sharing. "I've been trying to figure that out since I was 15, he said. "Want to hear what I've got?" What Peter had was not a solution, it was a practice. The daily, imperfect, costly practice of making the right choice in the immediate situation in front of you, regardless of what the institutional context surrounding it was doing. Not a philosophy, a method. Built choice by choice from the texture of real situations, none of which were clean. Cabba listened with the quality of attention he reserved for things that mattered. When Peter finished, Cabba said, "In Universe 6, we would call that the Warrior's Path without using the name for it." Peter looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" Cabba met his eyes steadily. "It is the highest one I know." Strange descended from his observation point that night. The one above the training yard. The one he had maintained since the early days of Cabba's presence here with the consistency of someone monitoring something they had not yet fully classified. He landed at the edge of the yard while Cabba trained and did something he had not done on any of the previous nights. He stayed, not analyzing, not maintaining operational distance, simply present in the quiet way of someone who had decided that presence was, in this particular moment, the most honest thing he could offer. Cabba acknowledged him without breaking his training rhythm. They stayed like that, the Sorcerer Supreme and the Universe 6. Saiyan, in the specific, companionable silence of 2 people who had arrived at similar understandings through entirely different paths and had found, in that convergence, something that functioned like company without requiring the performance of it. Eventually Strange said, "Do you know what the most insidious thing about this universe is?" Cabba slowed his movement. "Everything it asks you to." "Oh, compromise?" Strange said. "It asks so reasonably. There is always a logical framework, always a legitimate concern, always a genuinely good argument for why the principle needs to bend slightly in this specific case for this specific reason." He paused. "And the bending is always slight, until you look back, and the distance is not." Cabba stopped completely, stood in the still air of the training yard and felt the specific weight of what Strange was describing. Not as a warning, but as testimony. "Yes," Cabba said quietly. "That is exactly what I have been watching." Strange looked at him with the expression of someone who had hoped to be wrong about something and had found, once again, that he was not. "Then you understand what staying here costs," he said. It was not a question. Cabba held his gaze in the cold night air of a universe neither of them had chosen as their permanent residence, and said the thing that was true without making it more or less than it was. I understand. I have not decided yet whether the cost changes the answer. Strange nodded once, slowly, with the gravity of someone who respected an honest uncertainty more than a confident conclusion. Above them, the city's floodlights threw long shadows across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, 3 more signals were registering on Shuri's device. The universe was not waiting for the answer. It never did. Some endings do not look like endings when they arrive. They look like Tuesday mornings. Ordinary light, ordinary air, the specific, unremarkable quality of a day that has not yet decided what it is going to be. The dimensional breach that Strange's instruments flagged at 0847 hours on a Tuesday morning carried none of the dramatic architecture that Marvel's universe had trained everyone within it to associate with cosmic significance. No thunder, no visible rupture in the sky, no energy discharge registering on civilian sensors or triggering the automated alert systems that the city's infrastructure had developed across years of superhuman catastrophe as a kind of learned institutional reflex. Just a quiet fracture in local space-time, pale-edged, cold, approximately 2 meters wide, appearing in the air above a street in the Eastern District with the specific lack of ceremony that Strange had warned Cabba about weeks ago when the topic had first become relevant. "If it opens," Strange had said, "it will not look like a door. It will look like a mistake in the air." It looked exactly like a mistake in the air. It was the way home. Strange contacted him the moment the instruments confirmed it. Stable, viable, estimated window of 40 to 120 minutes before cosmic drift closed it permanently. His voice carried the specific, careful neutrality of someone delivering information they understood was going to produce a complicated response and had decided that the most respectful thing they could do was deliver it cleanly, without editorial, and allow the response to be whatever it was going to be. Cabba received the communication mid-movement in the training yard, registered it completely, and began moving toward the breach coordinates immediately. East, approximately 4 kilometers, manageable under his own power in under 2 minutes. The city was already active around him, the morning's ordinary density of movement and noise and the low background frequency of millions of lives proceeding in parallel. He rose above the rooftops and oriented toward the coordinates and felt, for the first time in weeks, the specific frequency of Universe 6 pulling at something beneath his conscious awareness. Not a sound, not a sensation exactly, more like a direction. The way north pulls at something in certain animals without requiring explanation. Home had a frequency. He had forgotten that, in the accumulated density of everything Marvel had given him to pay attention to. He remembered it now, and the remembering was its own complicated thing. He was 3 kilometers from the breach when the building came down. Not all of it. A partial structural collapse, the eastern face of a residential tower that had sustained unrepaired damage from the Kang engagement 3 weeks prior and had been flagged in the city's infrastructure assessment for priority remediation and had not yet received it because priority remediation in a city that sustained superhuman damage at Marvel's frequency was a category containing more items than available resources could address simultaneously. The collapse registered on Cabba's awareness before it registered on any alert system. The specific Ki texture of compressed, panicking life signatures, the architectural sound signature of load-bearing failure translating into the particular frequency that his training had indexed as people in immediate structural danger. He counted the signatures automatically, the way he counted everything. 17. The number landed with the specific weight of things that arrive as coincidence and feel like something that has no name but is not coincidence. 17. The same number as the facility. The same number that had stopped him in that corridor 3 weeks ago. He did not spend time on the meaning of that. He turned toward the building. What happened in the next 31 minutes is worth describing with the precision it deserves, because the precision is the point. Cabba did not tear through the collapse. He did not apply maximum force to the problem and accept the structural consequences as acceptable cost. He moved through the failing building the way he moved through everything. Architecturally, with the understanding of load distribution and cascade failure and the specific geometry of how structures fall that his training had developed not as a tactical skill but as a fundamental expression of the principle underlying every tactical skill he possessed. He found paths that existed because he understood why they existed. He extracted people through routes that preserved rather than accelerated the building's remaining integrity. He carried those who could not move with the specific combination of physical capability and deliberate care that the situation required, not gentle in the performative sense, but calibrated, the way that genuine care is always calibrated to what the person actually needs rather than what looks like care from the outside. The 14th person came out with 9 minutes remaining on Strange's most optimistic breach stability estimate. The 15th with 7, the 16th with 5. Cabba went back in for the 17th. The 17th was a child. Of course it was a child. And before that observation collapses into sentimentality, understand that the reason it matters is not emotional, or not only emotional. It matters because of what it cost, and because of what Cabba did not spend a single second doing when he found her, which was calculating. She was conscious, frightened, trapped under a section of collapsed secondary wall that was not heavy enough to be immediately dangerous and was wedged against a load-bearing element that made removal require a specific sequence Cabba identified in approximately 1 second and executed in approximately 4. He wrapped her in the specific quality of calm that trained people extend to frightened people. Not performed calm, the real kind. The kind that communicates, I am not afraid of this situation, which means you do not need to be afraid of this situation either, and move toward the exit through a building that had approximately 90 seconds of remaining structural coherence. He came out into the morning light with the child, and 3 seconds later the eastern face finished its descent with the deep, conclusive percussion of something that has been holding on for as long as it was able and has finally decided it is done. The monitoring team's present recorded his emergence time. Strange's instruments recorded the breach stability at that moment. The window had 4 minutes remaining. Cabba rose from the collapse site into open sky. The child passed to the emergency response team below and turned east toward coordinates where a pale fracture in the air was spending its last minutes of coherence waiting for him. He flew at the ceiling of his speed, not held back, not calibrated, genuinely as fast as he was, which registered on every monitoring instrument in the city simultaneously and produced a pressure wave that would generate 3 news segments about unexplained atmospheric phenomena before the end of the day. He arrived at the breach with 3 minutes and 40 seconds remaining on Strange's estimate. It hung in the morning air exactly as Strange had described it. Not a door, a mistake. Pale-edged, cold, carrying the specific frequency of Universe 6 with an intensity that was almost physical now, close enough to be undeniable. Strange was there. Thor. Peter, in full suit, mask off. That specific gesture, that choice, extended one final time. Steve Rogers standing slightly apart with his hands at his sides and an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, none of them simple. And Fury, which surprised Cabba more than any of the others. Fury, who had stood at the operational center of everything, who had never attended a single informal moment of Cabba's presence in this universe, who had filed reports and read transcripts and sat alone with things he did not distribute. Fury, present without explanation, hands in his coat pockets, watching with the expression of a man who had decided that some things were worth witnessing in person rather than through a surveillance feed. Cabba looked at the breach for 30 seconds. The monitoring equipment logged it as a behavioral anomaly, the only measurable hesitation in his desist. Ion-making patterned since arrival, but hesitation was not the right word for what those 30 seconds contained. Hesitation implied uncertainty about the decision. What those 30 seconds contained was something more specific, a complete, deliberate accounting of the moment before moving through it. He counted what he was carrying out of this universe. The understanding that protection was a sustained argument rather than a single act, that institutional logic and moral logic were different instruments measuring different things, that the most dangerous quality a person could bring into a broken system was the refusal to accept that brokenness as the natural state of things. He counted what he was leaving, 17 people who had come out of a building that tried to take them, a conversation with T'Challa that would take years to fully unpack. The specific quality of Peter Parker's sincerity, which had been the first genuinely familiar thing he had encountered in this universe, and which he would think about for a long time. Thor's question, still unanswered. What do you do about a universe that tries to use you? Hanging in the air of the training yard where the alarms had interrupted the answer. He looked at the faces in front of him and did not perform the moment. He simply held it, clearly and completely, for 30 seconds. Then he stepped through. The breach sealed behind him with a sound that Strange described in his personal notes as the quietest significant thing he had heard in a very long career of significant things, not the dramatic closure of a cosmic event. A soft, final, complete sound, like a question that has been outstanding for a long time receiving its answer. The space where the fracture had been was simply air, Tuesday morning air. Tuesday. The city moved around the small cluster of people standing on an ordinary street looking at ordinary sky, and the city did not know what had passed through it in the past 3 weeks and what had just departed. That was the specific way that the most important things moved through Marvel's universe. Not announced, not formally processed, not filed under a category that the institutional infrastructure had prepared for. They moved through the people. And what they left behind was not policy, not protocol, not anything that would appear in a threat assessment or an oversight report or a strategic recommendation memo. What Cabba left in Marvel's universe was the specific residue of someone who had passed through it completely intact. The lingering evidence in the people who had encountered him of what it looked like to carry a principle without compromise through conditions specifically designed to make compromise feel reasonable. Rogers changed 3 protocols that week, quietly, without announcement or attribution, each one moving incrementally toward the position that protection and institutional interest were not the same thing and should not be operationally treated as equivalent. Stark filed a private document, addressed to himself because some reckonings are personal before they are professional, that contained 1 sentence and no further elaboration. He was right, and we all knew he was right, and we made him prove it anyway, and that says everything about us and nothing about him. Strange reclassified 6 active threat assessments involving enhanced individuals and opened a review process he had been deferring for 2 years because Cabba's presence had removed the specific comfortable inertia that long deferrals depend on. Shuri published her Chi analysis in 3 papers that cited in their philosophical frameworks principles she attributed to Asai, and Warrior, whose institutional file Marvel will likely misfiled under threat categories it invented because it lacked the framework for what he actually was. A person who meant exactly what he said. And Peter Parker swung through the city on a rainy afternoon and thought about the word practice, the specific word he had used on the rooftop, the daily imperfect, costly practice of making the right choice in the immediate moment, and felt it settle differently than it had before, heavier and more real, like something that had been theoretical had been made concrete by the specific evidence of someone who lived it without calling it anything. Fury reviewed the 30 seconds of sensor data from the breach, the hesitation that was not hesitation, the accounting, the complete deliberate holding of the moment before departure, and sat with it in his private office for a long time. He had spent 30 years cataloging what human beings were capable of at their extremes. He had files on the worst of it and files on the best of it, and very few things had required him to create a new category. He created one that afternoon. He did not name it in operational language. He named it in his private notation system with the only word that fit accurately: integrity. Not as a performance, not as a strategy, as a structural feature. The thing that stays the same regardless of the pressure applied to it, regardless of the institutional incentive to let it flex just slightly in this specific case for this specific reason. The thing that Cabba had brought into Marvel's universe in his hands, and his training, and his 30-second accounting at the breach site, and had carried back out again, completely, without leaving a single piece of it behind as the cost of passage. And here is where this story ends. Not cleanly, because Marvel does not end cleanly, and because the most important things this universe now carried from a 3-week visit by a Saiyan it had tried to contain, categorize, deploy, and ultimately failed to fully comprehend were not clean things. They were questions. Persistent, uncomfortable, structurally unanswerable questions that would outlast every institutional response and every policy adjustment and every private reckoning and every office and training yard and rooftop where his presence had left its mark. Could Marvel have deserved him if it had tried harder? Could it deserve the next version of him? The next person who arrived carrying something intact that this universe consistently ground down? If it started trying now? Or was the grinding structural? Was the compromise built into the architecture at a level that no individual protocol change could reach? That question is yours now. I have laid out everything this story contains, and the answer is not in the story. It is in what you do with the question. So tell me, right now, in the comments, does Marvel deserve a warrior like Cabba? And more importantly, does it have any idea what it would need to change to become the kind of universe that could keep one?